Hello and welcome to Occupy Thought, the podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Peter Beinart, a fellow at the Foundation. Today is February 13th, 2025, and I'm glad to be here with Dima Khalidi. Dima Khalidi is the founder and director of Palestine Legal. She oversees Palestine Legal's array of legal and advocacy work to protect people speaking out for Palestinian freedom from attacks on their civil and constitutional rights. Dima, thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah, good to be with you, Peter.
So I know that repression of Palestinian speech and activism is not something new, and I know that it was intense in many ways during the Biden years as well. But I wonder if you can talk about what is new, what is different, or what has escalated since Donald Trump has returned to power.
Yeah, that's, I think, something that can be lost on people that nothing that's happening is really new in terms of what we've heard, what we've seen, the kinds of tactics that have been proposed and attempted. And, even before the upheaval since October 7th, 2023, and the massive mobilizations and the enormous repression that's followed, we've been working at Palestine Legal for over a decade now, challenging the kind of repressive actions against this movement that has grown steadily and more powerful as the years go by in calling for Palestinian freedom and liberation. And, so we've been documenting the kind of repression we see year after year, and it has grown steadily more intense and severe in the kinds of tactics being used to criminalize, to censor, to suppress people who speak out. So I think what the difference is, even since the October 7th and the enormous repression that we've seen, is that we now have an administration that is willing to implement all of the kind of fantasies of pro-Israel groups that they have been proposing and trying to advance for years. We started to see that certainly in the last year and a half since the genocide began, and mobilizations and protests and encampments on campuses happened. There was severe law enforcement, repression, brutality. There were lawmakers who were, uh, um, putting forth these McCarthyist congressional hearings and grilling university presidents for not doing enough to stamp out this movement. We saw universities themselves really ratchet up the pressure and take really horrible disciplinary measures against their students. And a huge amount of discrimination happening, anti-Palestinian discrimination. So since Trump was inaugurated, really, what the kinds of threats that for many years have been kind of pie in the sky are now actually more likely to be actionable under this administration that is taking a very ideological stance here, a very McCarthyist stance, um, to purge people from institutions in the government that, um, so take a stance on Palestine, or any other progressive value for that matter. So I think, when we're talking about the use of anti-terrorism laws or, laws that were designed to go after mobs, right? To go after the mafia, racketeering conspiracy laws, when we're talking about the use of extreme surveillance measures, the use of immigration laws that actually have ingrained in them an anti-Palestinian bent, but to really take action on some of these laws in a way that is directly targeting speech activity about Israel. is something that we've been concerned about for a very long time, but I think there's a serious threat that it's going to materialize under this administration that has no qualms about trampling free speech, trampling constitutional rights in order to achieve its ideological goals.
So you mentioned three things in particular. I wonder if maybe we can just drill down into them a little bit. The first thing was you mentioned was racketeering, the use of legal tactics that are used against criminal organizations, against against pro-Palestinian activists. Can you just talk a little bit about what's happening in that regard?
Yeah, so if you look at I think the most apt example is the use of what is called RICO, which is a criminal statute, also a civil statute, but it's intended to go after racketeering, conspiracy, originally intended to go after mafias and whatnot. That has been used most recently against the Stop Cop City movement in Atlanta. And so the protests and the organizing, the bail funds, the mutual aid that was organized to stop this massive police complex from being built on, forested lands, um, was criminally charged as a conspiracy, and they went after individuals as a criminal conspiracy. And so this tactic has been named by Zionist groups for some time now. We've seen Zionist organizations call on the DOJ to investigate Palestine activism as a conspiracy or as terrorism or support for terrorism, for example. And pre-inauguration, we saw in Project Esther the same kinds of
This is the
recommendations.
Heritage Foundation's kind of blueprint for cracking down on pro-Palestinian activism, right?
Right. The kind of offshoot of Project
Right.
2025, and
Right.
that is specifically targeting the Palestine movement. And that document laid out a kind of blueprint to target, to undermine, to crush the Palestine movement, including by using by basically criminalizing speech activity. So this again is not new in the sense that this has been proposed for a very long time, but it's an obscene overreach, right? And I think what we're seeing now with a DOJ that has set up a task force to, go after so-called anti-Semites or supposed support for terrorism, there is a huge focus on using legal avenues, criminal statutes to target speech activity, and we've been seeing this rhetoric for certainly since October 7th, but even before then. But with Biden saying that he would sic law enforcement on. And increase surveillance of this movement. We know that really set the stage for what Trump is doing now. And there has been bipartisan support for it. And I think that's one of the really dangerous things about this moment is that really the Palestine is the thin edge of the wedge here, in the sense that there is widespread Democratic and Republican support for anti-Palestinian racism, for crushing the Palestine movement specifically. And if we allow them to do that, it really opens the door to crushing all political dissent.
Right. So let me just understand the legal argument that the Trump administration or their allies seem to be making. They're saying that I imagine that, if someone were actually buying weapons for an organization that's classified as a terror group in the United States, then you could use these laws to prosecute, right? But it doesn't seem like they have any evidence that people are doing that. So what are they actually saying that people are doing when they claim that these are people who are, accomplices to terrorism or participating in terrorism? And does that can their arguments hold up in court? I think you're muted.
That's a really important question because it goes to the very problems with anti-terrorism laws to begin with, which are incredibly vague
Mm-hmm.
and broad, and do strike at fundamental constitutional rights
Mm-hmm.
of speech in particular, and they have been challenged for those reasons. But a Supreme Court case called Humanitarian Law Project, um, basically the Supreme Court said that even if you are providing legal services or if you are training people on peace initiatives, a designated terrorist group on peace initiatives, that is terrorism. And they also said that um, coordinated advocacy on behalf of a terrorist group or under the control of a terrorist group, designated group, is also considered material support for terrorism. So it's not just guns, it's not just money. Um, there's this whole gray area of what kind of coordinated advocacy would constitute material support for terrorism under these laws, under these criminal statutes. I think this is the gray area that uh, um, Israel, its allies, and lawmakers, and the Trump administration in particular, are trying to fill, to allege that, even echoing something that Hamas might have said, for example, about the liberation of Palestine, which is not does not belong to Hamas. It's not. It's a widely
River
held.
to the sea. If they say river to the sea, Palestine will free as a Hamas slogan, then if you
Exactly.
use that slogan, then
Right, which, there's been much written about the history of that slogan. It's a
right,
very popular political
right.
slogan, etc.
Predates Hamas,
But say again,
which predates Hamas, right? It's not like
which
Hamas
predates
invented it. Yeah.
Hamas, of course. These things can be manipulated really easily to say that somebody supports Hamas or advocates for terrorism or what have you. And of course, at this moment, when there is ongoing resistance to Israel's genocide in Gaza, there is a lot of conversation about what resistance is and what, the futility of resistance and all of these things. And I think so many things can be twisted to mean, support for terrorism when, we're talking about a national resistance movement that has been ongoing for many years. So, this vagueness in the law is exactly what this administration is trying to take advantage of in order to criminalize speech activities that, like if we can't engage in debate about, these issues about what Palestine should be, how Palestine should be freed, the nature of armed resistance and various tactics that are being used, not to mention criticism of the state of Israel and its actions. Where are we left, right? It's really trying to impose an ideological strangulation on this issue.
And do you actually think that there are courts that would rule that people who were pro-Palestine activists in the United States were, giving material support for terrorism because they're, mouthing a bunch of slogans or kind of engaging in kinds of discourse? Could that really happen, or is it more the danger just more that by bringing these cases, even if you don't win, you still end up imposing a real cost?
Yeah, well, again, this is such a gray area in the law. It hasn't been tested that much in terms of how much pure speech can be criminalized. But, we have seen over the years with the war on terror that some of the most ridiculous actions that have been prosecuted and people have been convicted for, uh, things that uh, you would think were okay, right? Or not at least not support for terrorism in the same way. And, at the same time, we have also seen courts reject these kinds of arguments in civil lawsuits brought by Zionist groups trying to hold civil society groups accountable for actions of groups that are designated as terrorist in Palestine. And those have failed because the courts have recognized that there is not enough causation there, that there is so that the kind of causation is so far removed from any actions that actually happen. So, for example, they allege that the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, which is a big national or advocacy organization, tweeted support for the Great March of Return in Gaza, and that was enough to hold them accountable for some like flammable balloons and kites that Hamas sent over and that caused forests to burn, right? It's just such an absurd thing to try to pin accountability on a group just for tweeting something, right? Or expressing support for a mass mobilization of Palestinians on the ground. So I think there it isn't necessarily guaranteed or a certainty that a criminal prosecution, for example, will succeed. But at the same time, we know that Trump in his first administration stacked the courts with ideological appointees, with far-right appointees. We also know that the Supreme Court is hostile in general to a lot of issues, including this one. And so I think there's a real possibility that we will see a very harmful evolution of the jurisprudence on this issue. Um, like I think the other piece of it, which I think you're alluding to, is even if it doesn't actually succeed in court, the time that it takes for a case to go through the legal process, not to mention the extreme exposure when, a prosecution happens, when somebody is indicted, when somebody goes to trial, right? They are presumed guilty. They are smeared in the press. And it can cause a chain reaction of suspicion, surveillance, efforts to prosecute. Um, so I think there are a lot of even threats before we even get to a prosecution that we've already seen unfolding, right? We've seen an increase in surveillance and FBI visits and in law enforcement agencies surveilling social media for, any mention, any criticism of Israel or U.S. foreign policy or what have you. So the threats are beyond just the viability of a legal argument.
So can you talk a little more about that surveillance? I don't know if you're at liberty to get into specific examples, but when you talk about the FBI or surveilling people's social media or police coming to people's homes or whatever, what are the kinds of on what pretext are they doing this and with what ramifications?
Yeah. A lot of the things that we hear are, people being visited by the FBI, and specifically because of their social media presence. We hear a lot also of reports to the FBI of people's or other law enforcement agencies of people's on the ground activities. So sites like Canary Mission or others will actually, call on the FBI to investigate
Do you want
something
to just
because
tell people what Canary Mission is if they haven't had the good fortune of having
yeah,
heard
yeah.
it before?
It's basically a website, an outfit that profiles individuals, mostly students, professors, for supposed anti-Semitic or anti-Israel and what they call un-American speech about Palestine or Israel. So, they have these kind of McCarthyite profiles of folks, and they don't only report things to law enforcement, but they report things to people's employers and universities. And we have seen that result many times in, HR investigations or university disciplinary processes against students based on, these inflammatory, out of context kinds of accusations against people, often, solely because of their advocacy for Palestinian rights. So, the point being that, these social media has become a huge resource for law enforcement to mine for indications or hints that somebody holds certain views, and it's used in very problematic ways to infer some kind of criminal intent or some kind of violent intent, and it's frankly a really racist tool to try to pin some kind of nefarious intent on people, right?
Right. So this may be like a really naive and almost childlike question, but if so,
Not from you, Peter.
well, I mean, I guess I'm almost imagining a different world that but could exist, but I'm sure it doesn't. If it's possible that someone could get in legal jeopardy for saying something that could be interpreted as supporting Palestinian armed resistance, Palestinian use of violence, why is it not the case that somebody who said on social media, Israel should force all the Palestinians out of Gaza, or even Israel should kill all these Palestinians? Why would that person not be in legal jeopardy, given that that is a clear call for violence? And people say these things frequently, sometimes pretty prominent people.
Indeed. Really, because we have a First Amendment, neither of those things are
Right,
prohibited speech,
right,
actually,
right,
unless something is an imminent call to violence and can
right,
actually cause that violence, immediately.
right,
Those are not prohibited things to say
right,
in theory, right? We are under the First Amendment
right.
and even, under anti-terrorism laws, independent advocacy, saying, I think what Hamas is doing is great, is actually protected First Amendment speech.
Mhm,
And,
mhm,
and saying that, oh, well, it would be great if Israel wiped Palestinians off the map
right.
is protected First
It's
Amendment
protected
speech,
speech. Right.
technically, right? The what's happening here is the attempt to criminalize certain kinds of speech or
Mhm,
to label certain kinds of speech as beyond the pale, as anti-Semitic,
mhm,
for example, and to punish that
mhm,
in other ways,
mhm,
through anti-discrimination laws, for
mhm,
example,
mhm,
right? And that's where we're seeing this double standard as well, where this rampant anti-Palestinian racism that has allowed this genocide to happen, that makes it totally okay for Netanyahu and other Israeli officials and U.S. officials to say, uh, shut it down, wipe it out, wipe them out, for Trump to, even propose committing war crimes by ethnically cleansing Palestinians from Gaza. That has been normalized, and that is due to a deeply ingrained anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab racism. that really comes from a lot of things, but it's what allows Israel to exist as an apartheid state, to dehumanize Palestinians, to deny their rights to human rights, to self-determination, to the land that their ancestors are from, etc. So
Right.
I think that's the other piece of it, is that, we have deeply ingrained double standards about what is, okay and what is not. And it's also a very it's also a very intentional campaign to define anti-Semitism, as you know well, in a way that it encompasses any not only criticism of Israel, but advocacy for Palestinian rights, for Palestinian freedom.
Right.
So that has really become entrenched in popular discourse, in rhetoric among elected officials, and that is something that we have to challenge every step of the way to call out.
Right. So speaking of the anti-Semitism kind of charge as opposed to the terrorism charge, obviously one of the vehicles for this has been the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which has these examples like calling Israel a racist state, as in it could be an example of terrorism, I mean, of anti-Semitism, or comparing Israel to the Nazis could be. So when Harvard University adopts the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, does that have any tangible implications? Like, does it mean that if you or I went to speak at Harvard and said that Israel is racist, that we could then, be considered to be violent, I mean, or students who write a paper or go on a protest, like, what are the actual implications? 'Cause I've also heard that other universities, you would know better than me, are also consider adopting this. So does it make, are there practical implications for a university adopting the IHRA definition?
Yeah, there are very practical consequences. Really, by adopting this definition, by normalizing it, it is telling universities and administrators to scrutinize certain speech, specifically speech related to Israel, and to be the ones to determine whether, what the intent of a speech is. Is it, just routine criticism of a country for its actions, or is it some kind of double standard, or is it uh, j just I think what that example in the IHRA says is to question what the state of Israel as a the self-determination of Jews
Right,
in
right,
Israel, right?
right, right,
So it leaves it up to universities to become censors of political speech,
right,
to determine the intent of certain speech, and that is fundamentally in tension with what universities are supposed to be for one. But it also really risks and almost ensures that speech, political speech, which is supposed to be the highest form of the most highly protected form of speech under the First Amendment, is going to be censored. Of course, Harvard is not subject to the First Amendment. It is a private school, but it purports to care about free speech,
right,
as most elite private institutions do, and has policies that are supposed to protect free speech. It almost ensures that universities not only are going to increase scrutiny of speech activities, but also to punish them, to censor them. And again, this is not new. This has already been happening for years and years, that universities are responding to complaints by Zionist groups, students who claim that, a Palestinian speaker is going to say anti-Semitic things, so you need to stop it, or that a chant is anti-Semitic and they feel threatened and you have to stop it, or that something a professor said in class was anti-Semitic and you have to, or on a, in the media or wherever is anti-Semitic and you have to do something about it. So we've already seen this play out. And I think the IRA definition, adoption of the IRA definition, makes it a policy and requires administrators to follow it. So it is a real threat to free speech, to academic freedom, the way it's applied also to professors, as I noted, right? It's not just about the student movement and student speech. It's about what you can put in a curriculum, what you can talk about in a class on Israel Palestine. There is the IHRA has also been pushed on the state level in legislatures, and one example is Florida that codified the IHRA definition, and they say that one of the examples of anti-Semitism, which isn't even in the IHRA, but it says, if you focus human rights investigations only on Israel, that is anti-Semitic, right? So God forbid somebody
Right.
do a report just on, the genocide in Palestine, and, that it would be anti-Semitic under this law in
Right. So
Florida.
then, right. So then, like, B'Tselem is anti-Semitic because they're not equally focusing on Myanmar, right? Like they're an organization specifically devoted to this issue.
Right, right.
It seems like some of the students who are most vulnerable in this regard are the students who are not U.S. citizens, and there's been this talk about deporting them. Is that actually happening? Where do things stand with this effort to deport students because they were involved in pro-Palestinian activism?
Well, we've seen the executive orders that are, directing government agencies to increase vetting of non-citizen students and others who, I mean, it's the most uh, ridiculous McCarthyist language, right? Who are un-American, or who don't conform to the culture of the United States, or who yeah, do things, basically engage in dissent, right? Um, and so they are specifically focusing on campuses. Another EO specifically focuses on campuses and calls for increased vetting and deportation or banning visas to students who engage in activism around Palestine. Um, we haven't seen yet actual deportations take place. But what's clear is that, again, like this, the surveillance mechanisms are churning, and perhaps churning at a faster pace. And, one of these executive orders also calls um, on agencies to basically get universities to become the snitches and the censors for them, to supposedly train them on how to identify and report on students who non-citizen students who are might be inadmissible because under immigration laws. So there is a clear attempt to push universities to play this role of being a snitch, of being the censor against its own students, and particularly non-citizen students. Um, so I think, as with a lot of what Trump is doing, a lot of these are meant to sow fear and create chaos and distrust, and are putting in place mechanisms to increase scrutiny of individuals based on speech activities. And I think eventually we will start seeing action taken against non-citizens, as we've started seeing deportations of other migrants, et cetera. But a lot of these executive orders are not immediately kind of activating actions, right? But they're directing agencies to do more and to increase deportations and ban more people, based again on ideological grounds, in very kind of McCarthyist kind of language about what is American and what is patriotic and what dissent is allowed or not allowed.
Right. So, my last question is, how concerned are you that this repression really will succeed? I mean, it seems like if we think back to American history, the first Red Scare in the early 20s, the Palmer raids, that really did crush the left in the United States for a decade, perhaps until it reemerged in the 30s. Or McCarthy period, I think, also was pretty successful in crushing left-wing movements in the United States. Maybe they reemerged in the 60s. But I was thinking about this because this writer Matthew Iglesias kind of put out a tweet yesterday who's basically like, well, I bet those pro-Palestinian activists, they don't seem nearly as loud now under Trump. I guess they're only have it in for Democrats. But what I thought was, well, it's there, the things are quieter, the encampments are not there because the repression has been so extreme, right? It's not like people are all of a sudden not upset with what the US and Israel are doing. So are you worried that actually this repression was started under Biden and with all these universities have participated in and is escalating could really deal a real setback to this movement?
Well, I think it's designed and intended to set back all movements for
Mm,
social justice.
mm,
And I think there's a real recalibration happening across movements and sectors and communities about what the real risks are and what people are willing to risk in order to not only advance causes, but to stop this crushing of any semblance of democracy, of any semblance of constitutional rights and et cetera. Um, I am pretty confident that this movement is going to show a lot of resilience. And it might look different, but people are. I think we have to take the opportunity now to drive home what might not have been so obvious to others, but feels so obvious now. When you have an administration saying, actually, it's white South Africans who are the victim here, right? Um, in the same way that they're saying, oh, it's Israelis or Jewish people who support Israel who are the victims, when there's an act of enacting a genocide. The doublespeak is so obvious. The kind of white supremacist ideological underpinnings are so obvious. The intent of this administration to gut anything that would restrain uh, um, Trump and his minions and acolytes and Musk and from self-enriching and increasing their power. Uh, um, there's we I think there's a moment where we have to really close ranks and figure out the strategies here to challenge all of this. I do think that uh, people aren't necessarily prepared for all that's possible in the next weeks and months and years. But I'm confident that there will be very strong resistance to what's happening. And that this movement is not gonna give up. I think the Palestinians on the ground are incredibly resilient. I mean, after 15, 16 months of this, they are still standing. They are committed to returning to their homes and their lands. They are committed to being human and their humanity. And I think Palestinians here and their allies really are committed to bolstering that Um, and this, we know as Palestinians that this is not a fight that is going to be won in a day or a year or 75 years, right? This is a long struggle. And there are also global conditions that are contributing to all of this. There is still hope. There's still really resilience in the movement. There's a defiance against these just so obviously fascist, authoritarian efforts, and I think we will see more and more resistance as we go, even if it might seem a little quiet now.
Uh, Dima, thank you so much for doing this. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you,
Uh,
Peter. I appreciate you.
I want to thank all our listeners for joining us today and invite you to check out our website, fmbp.org, for links to Palestine Legal's work and other resources we discussed today, plus many more resources related to Palestine Israel. Please make sure you're subscribed to the Occupied Thoughts podcast. We are on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Spotify, so you won't miss any of the great content we post nearly every week. You can also find a video of this and our other podcasts on YouTube and on our website, fmbp.org. And with that, we will end. I'm Peter Beinart signing off until the next episode of Occupied Thoughts.